3 days before the most powerful mafia wedding in South Korea, the only woman who knew the truth was lying half dead on a freezing bathroom floor, her fist locked around a blood-soaked flash drive like it was the last thing worth dying for. And the most feared boss in Seoul, instead of ordering a manhunt, drove alone to her miserable apartment. What he found behind that broken door would destroy everything he thought he knew. Hit like and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Stay until the end. This one you cannot stop halfway through. The call came at 4:47 in the morning. Kang Tae-hyun was already awake. He'd been awake since 3, sitting at the long obsidian desk in his penthouse office on the 42nd floor, staring at quarterly reports he'd read 4 times without absorbing a single line. Below him, Seoul glittered in the dark like something burning slowly from the inside. He'd grown up watching this city the way other men watched the ocean, with the understanding that it was beautiful and would kill you without hesitation. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was Woo Ji-hoon, head of internal security, a man who had been with the Baekho Syndicate for 18 years and who had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 internal purges, and 1 federal investigation. Ji-hoon did not call at 4:47 in the morning unless something was genuinely wrong. Tae-hyun answered on the second ring. Talk. Ji-hoon's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of flat that people practiced when they were delivering news they didn't want to deliver. Brooks didn't come in last night. She didn't respond to the emergency protocol. I sent 2 men to her building. The super says her door's been locked from inside since yesterday afternoon. Lights off. No movement. Tae-hyun didn't say anything for a moment. He set down the pen he'd been holding and looked at his hand. Steady. Good. And the Cheongdam files? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. The encrypted partition on her workstation. It's been wiped. External access logs show a manual extraction roughly 36 hours ago. Someone pulled the files to a portable drive and deleted the local copies. Tae-hyun stood up slowly. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Han River was a dark ribbon cutting through the city's glow. He stared at it without seeing it. Who else knows? Right now? You and me. Keep it that way. Don't touch her workstation. Don't reassign her access codes. Don't tell anyone she's missing. Director Kang Min-jae is scheduled to arrive at 7 for the pre-wedding security briefing. He'll ask about the Cheongdam partition. He handles the offshore accounts directly. He'll notice I said keep it that way. He ended the call. For a long moment he stood very still in the blue dark of his office, the city humming 42 floors below. Imani Brooks. He turned the name over in his mind the way you'd turn over a stone you'd stepped on 1,000 times without ever really looking at it. 6 years. She had been with the syndicate 6 years, which was longer than most of his lieutenants, and twice as long as his current head of legal. She had come to Seoul from Atlanta 4 years into a promising corporate finance career, following her mother, who'd been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's and had no one else. She had walked into the syndicate's legitimate holding company, Baekho Capital, through a standard hiring process, accepted a salary that was 40% below market rate without negotiating, and proceeded to become, quietly and without fanfare, the single most indispensable person in the organization. She handled everything: the encrypted financial records, the offshore routing documentation, the shell company maintenance, the coded scheduling system that coordinated the syndicate's legitimate and illegitimate arms. She could reconstruct 3 years of transaction history from memory if the servers went down, and twice she had. She attended every senior briefing, sat in the back corner, said almost nothing, and retained everything. She was never late. She had taken 4 sick days in 6 years, all of them confirmed medical appointments. She had never once tried to leverage what she knew, never negotiated for a raise, never complained about her hours, never asked for recognition. She was also a Black American woman in a room full of Korean men who barely registered her presence, which Tae-hyun had always understood was a feature rather than a failure. She moved through the organization like water through pipe, essential, invisible, unremarkable, until the moment it stopped flowing. And now she was gone. Along with the most sensitive financial documents the syndicate possessed. His fiancée called at 5:15. Han Seo-rin had a voice like cold silk, smooth and cutting in equal measure. She was 31 years old, educated at Sciences Po in Paris, and possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that presented itself as elegance. She was also, Tae-hyun had understood since approximately 8 months into their engagement, deeply calculating in a way that he had convinced himself was an asset. "I heard," she said. He hadn't told her. He noted that. "You heard what?" "That your little assistant has run off with half your filing system." There was something in her voice, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Tae-hyun, this is exactly what I warned you about. You gave that woman access to things she had no business touching. A foreign national with no real ties to this country, no loyalty to the family. She's been with us 6 years. She's been employed 6 years. Those are different things." A pause. The sound of silk moving, which meant she was sitting up in bed reaching for her phone to scroll while she talked, a habit he had noticed and never mentioned. "You need to authorize a full manhunt, every contact she has in this city. Her mother's hospital, the airport. She couldn't have gotten far with a hard drive and a carry-on bag." "I'll handle it. My father is going to hear about this by morning. The wedding is in 3 days, Tae-hyun. If there's a breach of this magnitude floating around, I said I'll handle it." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen of the penthouse, which he almost never used, and made himself a cup of instant coffee because it was the only thing in the cabinet. He drank it standing at the counter and thought about Imani Brooks for the first time as a person rather than a function. He thought about the Tuesday 6 months ago when he'd walked into the server room at 2 in the morning to find her still at her workstation, surrounded by printed transaction logs, cross-referencing something with the kind of focus most people couldn't sustain for 10 minutes. He'd asked what she was doing. She'd said there was a discrepancy in the routing codes for the Macau transfer, and she wanted to resolve it before the week's end report. He'd told her to go home and finish it in the morning. She'd said she preferred to finish things properly. He'd left her there and thought nothing of it. He thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she'd arrived at the weekly briefing with a thick manila folder she set on the table in front of him without comment. Inside was a detailed audit of a logistics subsidiary that had been running a 2% skimming operation for nearly a year. She'd identified it by noticing a pattern in fuel reimbursement claims. She'd documented it completely, named the 3 people responsible, and attached a recommended restructuring plan. He'd looked at the folder, looked at her, and said good work. She'd nodded and gone back to her seat. He told himself she was an excellent employee. He had not asked himself what kind of person spent that much effort protecting someone else's empire. He set down the coffee cup. He picked up his car keys. Ji-hoon called him as he was stepping into the elevator. "Sir, there's a security briefing at 7. Director Kang specifically requested your presence. He said it's critical given the wedding timeline, and move it to 9. Tell Min-jae I'm handling something." He won't like that. He rarely does. He drove himself. That was unusual enough that the 2 bodyguards stationed in the building lobby looked at each other as he walked past them to the underground garage and got into the black G-Wagon without a word. He drove north and east, away from the river, into the part of Seoul that didn't make it into real estate listings, where the buildings were narrow and pressed together like teeth, where the convenience stores were still lit at 5 in the morning, and the streets smelled like fryer oil and exhaust, and something vaguely chemical that you stopped noticing after a while. Imani Brooks lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in Jungnam-gu, 40 minutes from the syndicate's main offices. He had never been there. He knew the address from her personnel file, which he had read once at the time of her hire and twice more since, once after the Macau discrepancy, once after she identified the logistics skimming operation. He had read it because she troubled him in a way he didn't examine closely, the way a very clean room troubles you because you can't figure out where the mess is hiding. He parked on the street and walked up 5 flights of stairs that smelled like mildew and old cooking. Her door was at the end of a narrow hallway lit by a single fluorescent tube that flickered in a rhythm that suggested it was nearly dead. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Nothing. He tried the handle. Locked, deadbolt engaged from inside. He stepped back, looked at the door, and kicked it just below the handle with the heel of his shoe. The frame splintered. He kicked it again and it swung open. The apartment was small and absolutely dark. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The shape of it came together slowly. A living room that was barely the size of his office bathroom, a kitchen alcove with dishes drying in a rack, A low bookshelf crammed with textbooks and paperback novels, and 3 neatly labeled binders he recognized as syndicate documentation formats. A folded blanket on the couch that was too small for sleeping properly. A photograph on the wall above it, a woman in her 50s who resembled Imani around the eyes, smiling in front of what looked like a Georgia peach stand in summer. The bathroom door was half open. He pushed it open the rest of the way. She was on the floor between the toilet and the wall, folded in a way that bodies fold when they've been trying to get up and couldn't, when the attempt was made and failed, and the person just stopped where they landed. She was wearing work clothes, a dark blazer over a gray blouse, slacks, as if she'd come home and whatever happened had happened before she could change. Her left arm was pressed against her right side, and the fabric there was dark and stiff with dried blood. Her right hand was fisted around a small black flash drive. Tae-hyun crouched beside her. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck and found a pulse, weak, thready, but present. He felt something he could not name move through his chest and settle somewhere it hadn't been before. He pressed his hand flat against the floor and leaned close to her face. Brooks. Her eyelids moved. Not much. The movement of someone very far underwater trying to surface. Imani. He used her first name. He wasn't sure he'd ever used it before. Her eyes opened. They were bloodshot and glassy with fever, and it took several seconds for them to find his face, and when they did something and her expression went through several stages too fast to read, recognition, relief, and then something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. Her lips moved. Almost nothing came out. He leaned closer. Don't. Her voice was a scrape, almost no air behind it. Don't marry Seorin. She swallowed, which seemed to cost her significantly. It's a trap. All of it. The wedding, it's a... She stopped. Her hand tightened on the flash drive. Everything's on here, every transfer, every name. Another swallow. They know I have it. They came back last night. I locked the door, but... Stop talking. He got his arm under her shoulders. She hissed at the movement, a sharp, involuntary sound, and he felt the stiffness of dried blood under his hand. I'm going to move you now. The drive. Her grip tightened further, the knuckles going pale. I see it. Don't let go. He got her up slowly, the way you move someone when you don't know the full extent of the damage, feeling for resistance and working around it. She was heavier than she looked, or he was more shaken than he felt, or both. He got her upright, and she managed to bear enough of her own weight to make it possible, though her breathing was labored, and she kept her free hand pressed against her right side. He walked her out through the apartment, through the splintered door, down 5 flights of stairs that took them 4 times as long as they should have. She didn't speak again. She focused on the stairs with an intensity that was almost frightening. The focus of someone who has already decided they are not going to die today and is refusing to revisit the question. In the car, he called Dr. Shin Yu-chan, who was not affiliated with any hospital and whose number was in Tae-hyun's phone under a contact name that meant nothing. He told Shin to meet him at the Mapo safe house in 40 minutes, and that the patient had a knife wound and possible fever, and that discretion was not optional, it was structural. He drove. Imani was in the passenger seat, reclined, the flash drive still in her closed fist. Her breathing was audible in the car. Not the sound of someone unconscious, but the sound of someone staying conscious through deliberate effort. How long have you been on that floor? He asked. A pause. Since around midnight. Her voice was a little stronger now, still stripped raw. They came at 11, 2 of them. I got away, but one of them caught me on the stairs. I made it back inside and locked it. She paused. I didn't want to call anyone. I wasn't sure who... She stopped. Who you could trust. She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. The files, he said. Vams, the Cheongdam partition. I pulled them to the drive before I ran. A long breath. They were trying to get into the partition remotely. Someone with admin-level credentials. I didn't know how much time I had, so I pulled everything I could and wiped the local copy. If they got in after the wipe, they'd find nothing. If I didn't make it... Her voice caught for the first time, and she steadied it with visible effort. At least they wouldn't have it. Tae-hyun kept his eyes on the road. Seoul was beginning to lighten in the east, gray and cold and indifferent. Why didn't you come to me when you first found something? A silence that lasted almost a full minute. He waited. Because the first thing I found, she said quietly, pointed at someone in your inner circle. And until I had enough to be certain, coming to you with half a story would have gotten me killed. She shifted, winced, steadied. People like me don't get the benefit of the doubt. If I walk into your office and tell you I think someone close to you is running a conspiracy, and I don't have complete proof, I'm not the brave whistleblower. I'm the unstable employee who needs to be neutralized before she causes damage. He had no answer for that. He drove. The safe house in Mapo was a 7th-floor apartment in a building full of professionals who minded their own business and didn't look twice at people coming and going at unusual hours. Tae-hyun had used it 3 times in 6 years, twice for witnesses and once for a lieutenant who needed to disappear briefly during a federal audit. It was maintained by Park Sung-mo, his most senior bodyguard, a man of 52 who had an extraordinary talent for existing in spaces without being remembered. Sung-mo was waiting in the apartment when they arrived. He took one look at Amani, looked at Tae-hyun, and said nothing except, "Bathroom's the second door, clean towels in the cabinet." Dr. Shin arrived 28 minutes later with a medical bag that could have stocked a small clinic. He examined Amani with the efficiency of someone who had treated injuries that could not be documented, asked 3 questions, and got to work. Tae-hyun stood in the doorway of the bedroom while Shin worked and looked at the flash drive, which Amani had finally released into his hand just before the doctor started. It was a standard 128-gigabyte drive. Black casing, no markings, the kind sold at every electronic shop in the country. He turned it over in his fingers. Everything's on here. Every transfer. Every name. Sung-mo appeared beside him with a cup of tea that Tae-hyun hadn't asked for and probably wouldn't drink. "She gonna make it?" "Shin thinks so. The wound's deep but didn't hit anything critical." A pause. "She's been bleeding for hours without calling anyone." Sung-mo considered that. "Who did it?" "I don't know yet." He looked at the drive. "But I'm going to." His phone had been vibrating steadily for 40 minutes. 12 missed calls from Ji-hoon, 4 from Min-jae, 2 from Seo-rin's personal assistant, 1 from Han Seo-rin herself. He silenced it and put it in his pocket. When Shin finished and came out of the bedroom, Amani sedated, wound cleaned, and sutured, IV started. Tae-hyun sat at the kitchen table with a laptop that Sung-mo kept at the safe house for operational purposes and plugged in the flash drive. The encryption on it was the syndicate's standard protocol, the kind Amani herself had designed. He knew the master key. He opened the directory. The files were meticulously organized. That was the first thing he noticed. Even in whatever circumstances she'd been pulling these documents together, even knowing people were coming for her, she had organized the evidence with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. Folders labeled by date, by entity, by transaction type. Cross-references documented. An index file at the top level with timestamps showing she'd been compiling this for at least 3 weeks. He opened the index, and then he stopped. The name at the center of the document, the name that appeared in 11 separate transaction chains, in 6 sets of internal communications, in routing codes for amounts that totaled, across 18 months, $43 million, was not a name he had expected. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the safe house kitchen and breathed very carefully and deliberately for about 30 seconds. Kang Min-jae, his uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who had sat across from him at dinner tables for 30 years, who had held the syndicate together during the 14 months after his father's death when Tae-hyun was 24 and learning how to be what his father had been, who had taught him the offshore routing systems and the shell company frameworks and the coded communication protocols that kept the organization alive. The man who, in every room, in every meeting, introduced himself as the senior consigliere of the Baeko syndicate and looked at Tae-hyun the way you looked at something you'd built. The routing sequences told a clear story. For 18 months, money had been moving through a chain of shell companies, 8 of them registered in 4 different jurisdictions, into offshore accounts that were not syndicate accounts. The destination accounts traced to holding entities controlled by the Han crime family. Seo-rin's family, his future in-laws, $43 million. He kept reading. The internal communications file contained restored deleted emails. Amani had included a technical note explaining that she'd recovered them from backup servers the syndicate maintained as a contingency measure, backups that Min-jae, apparently, had not known about or had not thought to clean. The emails were between Min-jae and a man identified in the thread only as chairman, a title used within the Han family for Seorin's father, Han Guk-jin. The emails were careful, coded, but not careful enough for someone who had spent 6 years reading between the lines of syndicate communications. Amani had annotated each exchange with a plain language translation, noting which phrases corresponded to which operational terms, building a cipher key from patterns she'd clearly been tracking for weeks. Taehyun read the annotations. He read them slowly, the way you read something when you want to be wrong, and you're looking for the place where you're wrong, and you keep reading and the place doesn't appear. The wedding, the yacht, the security rotation scheduled for the day after the ceremony, when the team that had guarded Taehyun for 4 years would be replaced, temporarily, ostensibly for a single security audit, by a new team whose credentials Amani had traced to a private security firm that was itself a subsidiary of a Han-controlled holding company. An accident at sea. He closed the laptop. He sat in the kitchen of the Mapo safe house while the city outside brightened into morning, and he thought about the 18 months of dinners with Min-jae, the strategy sessions, the arguments he'd dismissed as the friction of 2 generations learning to share power. He thought about the way Min-jae had pushed for the Han engagement, had presented it as a natural alliance, had handled most of the negotiation himself while Taehyun managed other things. He thought about Seorin's voice at 5:15 in the morning, already knowing about the missing files, already applying pressure, already steering. He had been steered, he realized, smoothly and expertly, for at least 18 months, by the 2 people he had trusted most in the organization, by the woman he was 3 days from marrying. The bedroom door opened. Dr. Shin came out pulling on his jacket. She's stable. The fever's manageable. She needs 48 hours minimum of rest, ideally more. The sutures will hold if she doesn't move around too much. He paused. Whoever stitched her up initially, she didn't get stitched up initially. That wound was packed with cloth and held together with pressure. He looked at Taehyun with a professional flatness. She did that herself. He left. Sungmo stood in the kitchen doorway. He was holding Taehyun's phone, which had continued vibrating in the pocket of his jacket. Min-jae is calling again. Taehyun looked at the phone. Then he looked at the laptop. Then he looked at the bedroom door. Tell him I'm in a meeting. He turned back to the laptop and opened it again. And Sungmo, the camera system in this building. Covered. Anyone ask where I am? You're handling something. Good. He spent the next 3 hours reading everything on the drive. All of it. Every annotated email, every transaction chain, every technical note Imani had written to herself in the margins of the documents, notes that were clear and precise and completely unsentimental, the notes of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and had chosen, with full knowledge of the risk, to document it rather than sell it or use it as leverage or run. She could have run. She'd had weeks. She'd had $43 million in transaction evidence that would have been worth a significant amount to the right buyer. The Federal Organized Crime Task Force would have given her immunity and relocation assistance without hesitation for what was on this drive. Instead, she'd stayed. She'd kept coming into the office, processing the weekly reports, attending the briefings, sitting in the back corner and saying almost nothing. She'd stayed until they came for her, and when they came for her, she'd gotten away and locked herself in her apartment and bled on the bathroom floor rather than make a phone call that might have put the drive in the wrong hands. At 9 in the morning, he went to the wedding preparatory briefing at the syndicate's main offices and sat through 2 hours of security logistics and seating arrangements and catering approvals with Min-jae on one side of the table and 3 senior lieutenants on the other. And he said nothing unusual, asked no unusual questions, agreed to every proposed arrangement with the reasonable attentiveness of a man whose mind was entirely on the task at hand. Afterward, Min-jae clapped him on the shoulder and said the organization had never been in better shape. Said he was proud of how Taehyun had grown into the role. Said his father would have been proud. Taehyun smiled. He'd been smiling at this man for 30 years. One more wasn't difficult. Back in his car, alone, he called Ji-hoon. The Brooks situation, he said. Officially, she's been suspended pending investigation into the missing files. Issue a quiet alert. Airports, bus stations, border crossings. Make it look like a real manhunt. Keep it below the level where it reaches the outside. And actually? Actually, you don't know anything. A pause. Understood. He drove back toward Mappo. Imani was awake when he returned. She was propped against the headboard of the safe house bedroom, the IV still in her arm, the fever still coloring her face, but her eyes were clear and focused. She had the flash drive in her hand again, or rather, she had it on the blanket beside her, within reach, which was different. Progress. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at her for a moment. I read everything, he said. She nodded. She'd been expecting that. The annotations, the cipher key. He paused. You've been building this for 3 weeks. Longer than that. The first discrepancy I noticed was 7 weeks ago, the routing code irregularity in the Macau transfer. She looked at him steadily. The one I was still at my desk at 2 a.m. working on. He remembered that night. He told her to go home. I didn't understand what it was at first, she continued. A 2-point variance in a routing sequence. Most people would call it a clerical error. But the sequence itself was structured in a way that only makes sense if it was intentional. The variance was a destination tag, coded into the routing string. It took me 4 days to crack the pattern. She shifted carefully. Once I understood the pattern, I found it in 6 other transfers. Then 12. Then I started looking at the communication logs and I found the deleted emails. You didn't delete the backups. No. A pause. I set up those backup servers 2 years ago. Min-jae was in the meeting when I presented the proposal. He approved the redundancy framework. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile. He didn't read the technical specifications closely enough to understand what the backup cadence meant for data recovery. Taehyun was quiet for a moment. You've been sitting in those briefings for weeks, across the table from him. Yes. Did he know you suspected him? No. She said it with quiet certainty. Because I'm very good at being invisible. I've had a lot of practice. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning light through the window was pale and flat, and it sat on her face without softness, and what it revealed was not the blank, competent surface of the woman who sat in the back corner of his conference rooms. What it revealed was something more complicated and considerably more tired. How bad is the side? He asked. Manageable, which meant bad. Dr. Shin left additional medication. I'll be fine in a few days. You should have called me. Her expression didn't shift significantly, but something in it settled, like a door closing quietly. I've already explained why I couldn't. You could have... No. Firm, not loud. I couldn't, and you know that. She met his eyes. If I had come to you with this 7 weeks ago, with the first Macau discrepancy and a theory and no proof, what would have happened? Not because you're a bad person, because of what I am in that organization, what I've always been. She let that sit. I had to be certain. I had to have everything. I had to make it impossible to dismiss. He had no argument for that either. He was beginning to notice that she had a quality for rendering him argumentless, which was not something he encountered often. The wedding, he said. You said it's a trap. Yes. She reached for the flash drive. There are 3 documents in the secondary folder. The security rotation schedule, the personnel files for the replacement team, and a copy of the marriage agreement, the actual agreement, not the version you were shown. He went very still. The version I was shown. The version presented to you for signature had standard merger clauses. The actual agreement, which was filed with the Offshore Registration Authority in the Caymans 2 weeks before you were shown the draft, contains 6 additional clauses relating to operational transfer rights, asset inheritance provisions, and Baiko Syndicate restructuring protocols. She paused. In the event of your death within 6 months of the marriage. He picked up the laptop. He opened the secondary folder. He found the document she was describing and read the 6 additional clauses. He read them twice. Then he closed the laptop, set it on the floor beside the chair, and sat with his hands resting on his knees for a long moment. The replacement security team, he said. 8 of the 12 members traced to a private security firm called Haesong Protection Services. Haesong was incorporated 14 months ago. Its sole beneficial owner is a holding company registered in Singapore. The Singapore company is a subsidiary of Han Guk Jin's primary investment vehicle. She had clearly rehearsed the shape of this, or perhaps she'd simply been through it so many times in her own head that the sequence had worn itself clean. The yacht crew for the post-wedding celebration has also been replaced. I have the personnel records. The original crew was dismissed without notice 3 weeks ago. Min Jae arranged the yacht celebration. He also arranged the security rotation and recommended Haesong to your logistics team as a stopgap provider. The recommendation is documented in an internal email I recovered from the backup server. Taehyun stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the Mapo street below. A dry cleaner's, a convenience store, a woman walking a very small dog, and breathed through the specific sensation of having the floor removed from under a structure he had been standing on for 18 months. His uncle, the man who had handed him the keys to the empire and taught him how to use them. He turned back to Amani. 3 days, he said. Yes? If I cancel the wedding now, they disappear. The money's already moved. The offshore accounts will be cleaned out within 48 hours of any cancellation. Min Jae steps down quietly, citing health. The Han family denies everything. You have evidence of a conspiracy, but none of the principals, and the federal task force has been trying to build a case against the Han family for 4 years without success. She held his gaze. They walk. So I don't cancel it. She said nothing. I go through with it. He thought about Seorin's voice at 5:15 in the morning, already steering. I let them believe it's still working. If you can hold the performance for 3 days, Amani said carefully, I can have a complete financial dossier prepared for the federal task force by the morning of the wedding. Everything they need for the arrest warrants, every transaction, every entity, every name, documented, sequenced, and cross-referenced. A pause. I've been preparing it anyway. I just didn't know if you'd want to use it that way. He looked at her. You were going to give it to the task force yourself. If you had actually gotten on that yacht, she said, with a directness that landed like a slap, and was meant to. Yes. He stood by the window of the Mapo safe house in the pale morning light of a city that was going to try to kill him in 72 hours, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The particular sensation of realizing that someone had been standing between you and a disaster you hadn't seen, and that it had cost them significantly, and that you had never once looked over your shoulder to notice. I need to get back, he said finally. The security briefing this afternoon, I can't miss 2 in a row. I know. I'll have Sungmo check on you every 4 hours. Shin's coming back tomorrow morning. He picked up the laptop. I'm going to need copies of everything on this drive. The originals stay with you. I'll set up a redundant backup this afternoon. You're supposed to be resting. She looked at him with an expression that communicated, without words or particular sharpness, that she would rest when the situation permitted resting and not before. He picked up his jacket. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. Mr. Kang. He turned. She was looking at him steadily from the bed, the flash drive in her hand, the pale light flattening everything. Be careful, she said. He's been watching you for 18 months. He knows how you think. Taehyun held her gaze for a moment. So have you, he said. He walked out. The door closed behind him. In the hallway, he stood very still for a moment, his hand on the wall, and breathed. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning, indifferent and relentless, chewing through people the way it always had. 3 days. He walked to the elevator, straightened his jacket, and prepared to go back to work. He was almost to the street level when his phone vibrated. Not a call. A notification from the building's external surveillance system, which Sung Mo had linked to Tae-hyun's phone for emergencies. He looked at the screen. The camera covering the building's main entrance had captured a white envelope being slid under the lobby door by a hand in a black glove. No face, no other identifying features. In and out in under 4 seconds, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. Taehyun went back upstairs. The envelope was on the lobby floor. He picked it up. Inside was a single photograph printed on standard paper, slightly grainy, the timestamp in the corner reading 5:23 a.m., which was the time he had been carrying Amani from her apartment building to the car. The photograph showed him clearly, Amani clearly, her apartment building's facade clearly. Across the bottom of the photograph, in block letters printed in red ink, were 5 words. We know she survived. He stood in the lobby of the safe house building with the photograph in his hand and looked at those 5 words for a long time. Then he folded the photograph, put it in his jacket pocket, and went upstairs to tell Imani they were out of time. He went back upstairs. Sungmo was in the kitchen when Tae-hyun came through the door. He had a dish towel in his hands and he was drying a coffee cup he'd already dried once, which was the thing he did when he was thinking hard about something he hadn't decided to say yet. He looked at Tae-hyun's face and set the cup down. Problem. It wasn't a question. Tae-hyun handed him the photograph without a word. Sungmo looked at it. His expression didn't change significantly. It never did, which was one of the reasons he was still alive at 52 in a profession that averaged considerably younger. But something tightened around his eyes. He turned the photograph over, looked at the blank back, turned it again. Timestamp's 5:23, Tae-hyun said. 14 minutes after I pulled her out of the building. Someone was watching the street, or watching her building specifically. Sungmo set the photograph on the counter. Which means they had it covered before you arrived, which means they already knew she was still inside. They came back at 11. She said 2 of them. She got away, locked herself in. Tae-hyun took off his jacket and laid it over a chair. They couldn't breach the door without drawing attention, so they pulled back and watched the building, waiting for her to come out or for someone to come in. And instead you came in. Sungmo looked at the photograph again. They got what they needed. Proof she's alive, proof you know. Proof of this location. A pause. How long before they move on it? They can't move openly. Not 3 days before the wedding, not with the federal task force already sniffing around the Han family's eastern logistics operations. Any escalation that draws attention is a problem for them. Tae-hyun moved to the window. The street below was ordinary and quiet and told him nothing. They'll try something cleaner, something that looks like an accident or nothing at all. So we move her. We move her tonight, somewhere they haven't seen. He turned. I need you to find a location in the next 4 hours. Nothing connected to the syndicate, nothing in my name or yours. Pay cash. Sungmo nodded once and reached for his phone. Tae-hyun went to the bedroom. Imani was exactly where he'd left her, propped against the headboard, but she'd pulled the laptop onto the bed and had it open in front of her. She was pale, and her jaw was set in the particular way of someone managing pain through concentration, but her eyes were sharp and she was typing. She looked up when the door opened. He held up the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through her face. Not fear exactly, more like the confirmation of something she'd already been afraid of and had hoped to be wrong about. She took the photograph from him and studied the timestamp. 14 minutes, she said. They were watching the building. She set the photograph on the blanket beside her. They knew I hadn't left. They came back to verify. She looked at the laptop screen. I've been setting up the redundant backup, 3 separate encrypted cloud partitions with different access credentials. If anything happens to the drive, we're moving you tonight. She absorbed that without visible reaction. Where? Sungmo's handling it, somewhere clean. He sat in the chair. Can you travel? I can walk. The sutures will hold if I don't do anything aggressive. A pause. I'm not the primary problem right now. No. The primary problem is that someone in your security apparatus is feeding information out. They knew she was still in the building 14 minutes after you removed her. That's not a coincidence, and it's not luck. Someone in your organization, someone with access to your location data, is communicating with the Han family in real time. Tae-hyun said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. He'd already arrived at the same conclusion during the elevator ride. How many people knew you were going to her apartment this morning? She asked. Ji-hoon knew I was going somewhere. He didn't know where. Who else? No one. Ji-hoon then, or someone with access to Ji-hoon's communications. Ji-hoon has been with the syndicate 18 years. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has already explained this once and is deciding whether to explain it again. So has Min Jae, she said. Longevity is not the same as loyalty. You know that. He did know that. Knowing it and applying it to someone specific were different operations, and the second one was harder in ways that didn't get easier with practice. He'd already done it once this morning with Min Jae. He wasn't eager to do it again. I'll handle Ji-hoon separately, he said. In the meantime, you don't contact anyone outside this room. No calls, no messages. Nothing. I wasn't planning to. He stood up. I need to be at the Cheongdam offices in 2 hours for a financial review with the senior partners. Then there's a dinner tonight, wedding preparation, Seorin's father's people, Min-jae, the whole production. He said the last part without any particular inflection, the way you said things when the inflection was irrelevant. I'll be back after midnight. Mr. Kang. He paused. Be careful at the dinner, she said. If they know I survived and that you've seen what's on the drive, they may accelerate the timeline. They don't need to wait for the wedding if they can create another opportunity. He looked at her. You think they'd move before the ceremony? I think they'd prefer the clean narrative of the wedding and the yacht, because it's already arranged and the cover story is solid. But if they believe the plan is compromised, she stopped. Just be careful about what you eat and drink tonight. He held her gaze for a moment. Thank you, he said. He wasn't sure what exactly he was thanking her for. She seemed to understand anyway, and to find it slightly uncomfortable, which told him something about how long it had been since anyone had said it to her. He left. The drive to the Cheongdam offices took 35 minutes in morning traffic. He used the time to arrange his face and his posture, and the particular quality of attention he projected in rooms where he was being watched closely. He had been doing this since he was 24 years old, and he was very good at it, but it required a kind of internal compartmentalization that was not free. It cost something each time, something small and unmeasurable. And this morning the account it drew from was running lower than usual. Woo Ji-hoon was waiting in the lobby. Ji-hoon was 41, lean and angular, with a quality of stillness that most people read as calm, and that Tae-hyun had always read as controlled restlessness. He was good at his job. He was thorough and methodical, and he had a particular talent for seeing what people were trying to hide, which made him excellent for internal security and slightly uncomfortable to be around when you were hiding something yourself. Director Kang is in the conference room, Ji-hoon said, falling into step beside him. He's asking again about the Cheongdam partition. I told him there's an IT investigation ongoing. He seems... A fractional pause. Impatient. He's always impatient when something is outside his direct control. Tae-hyun kept his pace even and easy. The Brooks manhunt. What's the status on the public-facing side? Alerts are out at the transportation hubs. I've kept it quiet. Just the Tier 1 contacts, no media, no official channels. Officially, she's suspended pending investigation. Good. Keep it exactly there. He stopped at the elevator, looked at Ji-hoon directly. Who has access to my location data? Real time. The system that tracks my vehicle. Ji-hoon's expression didn't change. Standard tier. Me, Sung-mo, the 2 senior drivers, your personal security rotation, 4 men. A pause. Director Kang has read access to the historical logs, but not real time. He requested read access? 3 months ago, for audit purposes, he said. I approved it. I can revoke it. Do that today, quietly. System maintenance, don't make it specific. He held Ji-hoon's eyes for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Something passed between them. Not accusation, not quite, but the outline of a question that would need answering eventually. And Ji-hoon, the location access for this morning, from 3 to 6 a.m. I need to know if anyone pulled that data. Ji-hoon was very still. Are you asking if someone in the Tier 1 group ran a query on your location this morning? I'm asking you to check. A pause that was about 2 seconds long, which was long for Ji-hoon. I'll have it for you by this afternoon. Tae-hyun got in the elevator. The financial review lasted 3 hours and required him to sit across a table from Kang Min-jae for all of it. Min-jae was 61 and had been a compact physical man his whole life. Not tall, but built with the kind of density that suggested he'd done something rough in his youth and retained the residue. He had gray at his temples and a face that had settled into authority so completely that it was almost impossible to remember it had ever been anything else. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of a man who considered that his natural position, and he looked at Tae-hyun throughout the meeting with the combination of warmth and assessment that Tae-hyun had spent 30 years reading as love. He was reading it differently now. The meeting covered offshore liquidity, the Western logistics restructuring, and the Jeju casino expansion. Standard quarterly material. Min-jae was smooth and thorough and occasionally funny in the dry, deflating way that had always made the room relax around him. He asked pointed questions about the IT investigation into the Cheongdam partition and received measured non-answers that he accepted with visible but contained frustration. Twice during the meeting, Tae-hyun caught Min-jae looking at him with something that was almost a question. Not suspicion, the other direction. Evaluation. The look of someone checking whether the mechanism they'd set in motion was still moving on schedule. Tae-hyun gave him nothing but the surface. Relaxed, slightly preoccupied, the normal texture of a man 3 days from his wedding with the organizational details stacking up. He asked about the yacht arrangements. He asked about the post-ceremony guest list. He watched Min-jae's expression when he did and noted the micro-relaxation, the small exhale of a man hearing what he needed to hear. The meeting ended. Min-jae clapped him on the shoulder again, the same gesture as the morning, the same warm pressure. 3 days, Min-jae said. After everything we've built, watching you take this next step. He shook his head slightly. The performance was perfect. It had always been perfect. Your father would be at a loss for words. Tae-hyun smiled. I've been thinking about him a lot lately. Something flickered in Min-jae's eyes, too fast to identify. Good thoughts, I hope. Always. He went to his office and closed the door and sat for 4 minutes doing nothing at all, which was the exact amount of time he needed to put the thing he was feeling somewhere it wouldn't interfere with the rest of the day. Then he opened his laptop and read the reports that had accumulated and answered the messages that required answers and did the work of running an organization that he was apparently going to have to save from the inside without letting the inside know it was being saved. Ji-hoon came to his office at 2 in the afternoon and closed the door behind him without being asked. Someone pulled your location data this morning, he said. 4:49 a.m., 11 minutes before I called you. Tae-hyun looked at him. Who? The query was run using my credentials. A silence that lasted about 5 seconds. Your credentials, Tae-hyun said. Yes. Ji-hoon's voice was flat and controlled, and there was something underneath it that might have been anger and might have been something worse. I did not run that query. I was in the security monitoring center from 4 a.m. until I called you. There are 3 people who can confirm that. Someone used a copy of my access token. He paused. Which means someone inside Tier 1 has had my credentials compromised for at least long enough to learn your location this morning. Or someone outside Tier 1 obtained a copy. The token copies require physical access to the authentication system. It's not a remote operation. Ji-hoon stood very still. It's someone in the building, sir. Someone who's been here long enough to access the authentication hardware. Tae-hyun thought about the 4 men in Ji-hoon's Tier 1 location group. 2 senior drivers he'd known for years. 4 personal security rotation members. Min-jae's read access, which was now revoked. And Ji-hoon himself, who was standing in front of him telling him about compromised credentials with the specific quality of discomfort of someone who understood how this looked and was choosing transparency anyway. Is there any scenario in which you pulled that query yourself? Tae-hyun asked. Not because he believed it, because it needed to be asked. Ji-hoon met his eyes directly. No. Then find out who did. Don't tell anyone you're looking. Don't use the standard reporting channels. And when I find them, bring them to me, alive and unharmed. A pause. That last part is important. Ji-hoon left. Tae-hyun spent the rest of the afternoon being 3 days from his wedding. He reviewed the ceremony schedule with the event coordinator. He approved the floral arrangements because someone put the approval request in front of him. He took a call from Seo-rin about the honeymoon itinerary, and he listened to her voice for patterns the way he'd been listening since 5 in the morning. And what he heard was a woman who was very good and had been performing for him for so long that the performance had worn grooves, and he had never noticed because he had not been listening for grooves. She mentioned the yacht twice, both times with the particular kind of casualness that is not casual. I've been looking forward to the celebration sale, she said. Min-jae says the crew is exceptional. He always finds the best people, Tae-hyun said. He does. A small, warm pause. You're lucky to have him. I know, he said. I think about that a lot. He hung up and sat with his hand on the phone for a long moment, feeling the specific weight of playing a role in a play where the other actors didn't know he'd read the script. At 6:30, he drove to the Apgujeong dinner. It was held at a private dining room in a restaurant that the Han family used for sensitive meetings. Expensive, discreet, with the kind of staff who understood that good service meant not remembering faces. Seo-rin was already there when he arrived, in a dark green dress that was perfectly calibrated for the occasion, standing next to her father with the natural ease of someone who had rehearsed the scene so many times it no longer felt like rehearsal. Han Guk-jin was 67 and looked less like a crime family patriarch than like a retired professor. Slight, careful, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the deliberate speech of a man who had learned English at Oxford and Korean bureaucracy everywhere else. He shook Tae-hyun's hand with both of his and said how happy he was, and meant none of it with a thoroughness that was almost impressive. Min-jae arrived 10 minutes late, which was unusual. He apologized to the table, attributed it to a call he couldn't cut short, and sat down with the easy authority of a man who considers his own lateness a minor inconvenience to others rather than a failing. He caught Tae-hyun's eye across the table and gave him the small nod of an ally confirming position. Tae-hyun nodded back. The dinner was 2 hours of immaculate performance from all parties. The food was extraordinary. Tae-hyun ate carefully. Not obviously carefully, not in a way that drew attention, but he tracked what came from shared dishes and what was served to him individually, and he noted which of his glasses were refilled by the same server every time, and which were refilled by different hands. He drank very little. He ate from the shared plates. He noticed that Guk-jin watched him eat without appearing to watch him eat, and he noticed that Min-jae drank more than usual, which was the tell of a man running a calculation he was anxious to complete. The conversation was about the wedding. Logistics, family, the future shape of a combined organization that everyone at the table was pretending was a marriage and not a mechanism. Guk-jin talked about legacy and alliance with the fluency of a man who had been using those words as cover for other things for 40 years. Seo-rin was warm and occasionally funny and rested her hand on Tae-hyun's arm at the right intervals. Min-jae spoke with the proprietary warmth of a man who considered himself the architect of the evening and wanted that known without saying it. At one point, Guk-jin turned to Tae-hyun with an expression of polished concern. "I heard there was some trouble with your filing system. An employee matter." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I hope it's been resolved cleanly." "These things usually are," Tae-hyun said. "It's mostly paperwork at this point." Guk-jin smiled. "Good. The last thing you need 3 days before your wedding is organizational noise. A pause, the kind that is not accidental. I imagine you'll want things settled before the ceremony." "Completely settled," Tae-hyun agreed. They looked at each other across the table for a moment, two men having a conversation that had nothing to do with the words they were using. And then Guk-jin looked away first, which told Tae-hyun something useful. He was back in Mappo by 11:45. Imani was awake, which surprised him. She was at the small table by the window with the laptop open and a glass of water beside her and the flash drive on the table next to a notepad covered in her handwriting. She had changed into clothing that wasn't blood-stiff, which meant Sungmo had sourced something for her. She was in an oversized gray sweatshirt and dark pants, and without the professional armor of her work clothes, she looked younger and considerably more exhausted. She looked up when he came in. "How was the dinner?" "Instructive." He pulled off his jacket and sat across from her. Guk-jin mentioned the Brooks situation, unprompted. He called it an employee matter. She went very still. He used those words? He knew about the suspension. He knew it was being contained. He called it organizational noise. He watched her face. He was checking. "He was checking whether you know," she said quietly, "or whether you still think I'm just a missing employee." She looked down at the notepad. "If he believes you know, they'll move before the wedding." He looked away first. "That's not reassuring." She pushed the notepad toward him. "I've been finishing the federal dossier. It's about 80% complete. The core transaction chains are fully documented with source files, timestamps, and annotation. I need 2 more days to complete the personnel identification on the replacement security team and cross-reference the yacht crew records." "You have 2 days." She nodded and pulled the notepad back. They sat in silence for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of two people who don't know each other well enough for quiet, but something different. The silence of people who have covered a lot of ground very fast and are both slightly surprised to find themselves here. "Sungmo found a new location," she said. "Yongdong-po. An apartment registered to a name he wouldn't tell me, which I assume means you don't want me to know. It's cleaner that way." "I understand." She looked at the laptop screen for a moment. I want to tell you something before we move. He waited. When I found the first discrepancy, the Macau routing code, my first instinct was to say nothing. Document it, sit on it, wait to see if it resolved itself. She kept her eyes on the screen. I've spent 6 years being very careful about what I say and to whom. In a room full of people who don't look like me and don't particularly register my existence, you develop a very specific skill set around self-protection. You learn to measure the cost of every word before you say it. He said nothing. He understood she wasn't finished. I almost stayed quiet, she said. I want you to know that. I almost decided it wasn't my fight. It wasn't my family. It wasn't my empire. I had enough information to build myself a very quiet exit, and I almost took it. She paused. I didn't. For reasons I'm not entirely sure I can explain clearly, and that probably don't matter right now, but I want you to know it wasn't easy, and it wasn't automatic, and there was a version of this where I wasn't sitting at this table. Taehyun looked at her for a long moment. There were things he could have said that would have been true, that he was grateful, that he understood the cost, that he recognized, perhaps for the first time and too late, what it had meant to have her in that organization for 6 years, invisible, inessential, and unacknowledged. What he said was, I know. It wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough, but it was honest, and she seemed to receive it as such. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up. When Ji-hoon called me this morning and told me the files were missing, there was a moment. He held her gaze. A moment where I thought, I know what you thought. It was brief. I know that too. A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, more like the acknowledgement of something she'd been prepared for. You wouldn't be human if you hadn't. I'm easy to suspect. That's been true my whole life. She picked up her pen. But you came alone, and you came to the apartment instead of sending men, and that was... She stopped. That mattered. Taehyun's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Ji-hoon. He answered. Ji-hoon's voice was very quiet, the way it got when he was in a space where being overheard would be a problem. I found the credential breach. One of the rotation guards. Park Chan-woo. He's been with the security team 14 months. 14 months. The same window as the wedding negotiation. The same window as the Han family's security firm incorporation. Where is he now? Evening shift just ended. He's in the staff locker room. I have 2 of my own people in position. Hold him there. Don't let him make any calls. There's something else. A pause. He had a second phone. Burner. I checked the last outgoing message before we secured him. Another pause. Longer. It was sent at 5:31 this morning, 8 minutes after the photograph was slid under the lobby door. Taehyun's jaw tightened. What did it say? Confirmed alive. Director present. Location compromised. Awaiting instructions. The line was quiet for a moment. There was a reply, Ji-hoon said. Came back 6 minutes later. What did it say? Ji-hoon read it. 4 words. Taehyun stood up slowly. He looked at Amani across the table, at the notepad and the laptop and the flash drive, at the pale, careful face of a woman who had spent 6 years being invisible and 3 weeks bleeding for something she'd chosen instead of walking away from. Pack what you need, he said. Ji-hoon read it. 4 words. Move on her tonight. Taehyun stood very still in the center of the safe house kitchen and let those 4 words settle into him the way cold water settles, finding every crack, filling every low place. He looked at Amani across the table. She was watching his face and reading it the way she read everything, quietly and completely. And what she read there made her close the laptop with a soft click and reach for the flash drive without being told. Pack what you need, he said. We're leaving in 10 minutes. She didn't ask questions. That was one of the things about her. She had a precise understanding of when questions were useful and when they were friction, and she never confused the two. She closed the notepad, capped the pen, and began moving with the careful economy of someone managing a wound while trying not to look like they were managing a wound. He stepped back into the hallway and called Sung-mo. Get the car to the basement level, now. Don't use the front entrance. He kept his voice level and quiet. And Sung-mo, anyone you don't personally recognize in or near this building. We don't stop. We don't engage. Understood. 5 minutes. He went back to Ji-hoon. Chanwoo. Is he contained? Secured and isolated. I need him held somewhere clean and completely off channel until I tell you otherwise. Not the syndicate facilities, not anywhere Min-jae has access to. Use your personal contact, the one in Dobong-gu. A pause. Ji-hoon had a contact in Dobong-gu who did not exist in any syndicate database, a holdover from his own past that he had never fully disclosed and that Tae-hyun had never pressed him on. Using it now meant something. They both understood what it meant. Done, Ji-hoon said. And Ji-hoon, the reply message on Chan-woo's burner. Move on her tonight. He paused. That reply came from a number. I need to know whose. I'm already running it. How long? If it's clean, hours. If it's properly buried, longer. Another pause. Sir, the instruction was move on her, not move on you. I know. Which means whoever sent it still believes you don't know what's on the drive. Or they've decided she's the more immediate problem. He looked back through the doorway at Amani, who was folding the notepad into a bag with methodical care. Either way, we move. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment with his phone in his hand and the particular sensation of a situation accelerating past the speed at which it could be cleanly managed. 2 days ago, this had been a missing employee and a wiped partition. Now it was a mole with a burner phone and a 4-word instruction from someone inside or adjacent to his own organization who had decided that Imani Brooks needed to be handled before morning. He thought about the 4 words and what they implied. Not just the immediate threat, but the intelligence behind it. Whoever sent that message knew the photograph had been delivered, knew it had been received, knew that the clock on the original plan was running out. This wasn't panic, it was calculation. Someone had looked at the situation and decided that eliminating the evidence and the woman who held it was cleaner than waiting for the wedding, which meant someone was losing confidence in the wedding timeline, which meant something had changed. He didn't know what had changed yet. That bothered him more than the threat itself. They were in the car 8 minutes after the call. Imani in the back seat with the bag in her lap and the flash drive in her closed fist, Sung-mo driving with the specific quality of attention that turned ordinary city driving into something else entirely. Tae-hyun was in the passenger seat watching the mirrors. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. The Yongdong-po apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like concrete and other people's cooking and had a lobby camera that was positioned to cover the entrance but had, as Sung-mo had noted in his characteristically minimal way when he'd sourced the location, a 3-second lag on its recording cycle. The apartment itself was clean and bare. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a small bathroom, curtains that were heavy enough to matter. Imani sat on the edge of the bed and set the bag down and pressed her hand against her right side in a way she'd been doing periodically for the last hour. Not dramatically, just a check, like touching a door to see if it's warm. How bad? Tae-hyun asked. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She looked at him steadily. It's pulling. The sutures are holding, but the movement reopened some of the bruising. It's manageable. Shin can be here in an hour. After we talk. She set the flash drive on the table and folded her hands over it. You were going to tell me something in the car. You decided not to because Sung-mo was there. He had. She'd noticed. Of course she had. He sat in the chair across from her. Sung-mo had taken a position in the hallway outside the apartment door and would remain there until told otherwise. Chan-woo, he said, the guard who sent the message. Ji-hoon's running the reply number, but I don't think it's going to trace cleanly. Because whoever sent it is careful. Because whoever sent it knew exactly how to acquire someone else's credentials and use them for a location query. That's not a casual operation. That's someone who understands our security architecture from the inside. He watched her face. I've been trying to narrow the list of people who could have set up Chan-woo's access, who could have copied Ji-hoon's authentication token, who could have known which building we were moving to before Sung-mo arranged it. He paused. There is one name that fits every point on that list. She was very still. Min-jae has been the operational architect of the syndicate's security infrastructure for 11 years, Tae-hyun said. He designed the authentication protocols. He knows exactly how the token system works. He has had routine access to personnel placement decisions, including security rotation assignments. He looked at the table. Chanwoo was placed in the rotation 14 months ago. Min-jae approves all security placements at the senior level. You already knew all of this from what was on the drive, Amani said carefully. What I didn't know was how direct the operational line was. I thought Min-jae was the financial architect, the money, the offshore routing, the marriage agreement clauses. I thought the execution side was Han Guk-jin's people. He looked at her. But the credential operation that burned Ji-hoon's token, that's not a Han family move. That's someone who knows this specific system. Min-jae is running both sides, she said. It was not a question. I think Min-jae has been running both sides for a year and a half and using the Han family's resources while maintaining enough separation that if the Han family gets exposed, he has plausible distance. He paused. The $43 million. I've been reading it as money flowing to the Han family, money paid for the conspiracy. But what if it's the other way? Imani was quiet for a moment. He watched her work through it, the small movements of her eyes that meant she was restructuring a model she'd built on different assumptions. The routing chains, she said slowly. The shell companies are registered in jurisdictions that the Han family uses, which is why I read them as Han-controlled. But the actual beneficial ownership documentation, she reached for the laptop. I didn't go 3 layers deep on the Singapore entity. I confirmed Han Guk-jin's investment vehicle as the parent company and stopped there because it matched the pattern I was already building. She opened the laptop and navigated rapidly. If the Singapore company is itself a subsidiary of something else, something that Min-jae controls. She was already in the directory. She opened the corporate structure files and traced the Singapore entity through its registration documents. The first layer was Han Guk-jin's investment vehicle, exactly as she'd documented. She went 1 layer deeper. The Singapore company had 3 shareholders of record. 2 were Han family nominees she'd already identified. The third was a Cayman Islands trust entity that appeared once in her documentation and that she had flagged as a minor holding with no clear significance. She opened the trust documentation. The trustee of record was a name neither of them recognized, a nominee director, which was standard. But the trust's letter of wishes, attached as a subsidiary document that required a second decryption key she hadn't applied because she hadn't thought it was relevant, was authorized by a signature. She looked at the signature. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned the laptop so Tae-hyun could see it. He looked at the screen. He read the name under the signature line. He read it twice. The name was not Kang Min-jae. The name was Lee Seong-ah. He sat back in the chair. Something moved through him that was not quite any of the things he'd felt before. Not the cold anger of the morning, or the controlled pressure of the dinner, or the exhausted calculation of the last 20 hours. It was something raw and worse than all of those things. The specific sensation of a floor giving way beneath a floor you thought was the bottom. Lee Seong-ah had been dead for 4 years. Or rather, Lee Seong-ah was the name his father's second wife had used before she disappeared 3 months after his father's death, taking with her a significant amount of cash from a personal account, and leaving behind a handwritten letter that said nothing useful. She had been 34 at the time, 20 years younger than his father, and Tae-hyun had processed her departure as the pragmatic exit of a woman who'd understood that her position in the family died with her husband. He'd made no attempts to find her. He'd had other things to manage. He had not thought about Lee Seong-ah in 4 years. "She's not dead," Amani said quietly. She was watching his face with the care of someone watching a structure under load, checking for the first sign of failure. "You thought she was?" "I didn't think anything. She left. I assumed—" He stopped. "The trust was established 2 years before your father died," Amani said. She was back on the screen, moving through the dates on the founding documents. "It predates the marriage to your father by 8 months." She paused. "She wasn't a grieving widow who made a pragmatic exit. She was positioned inside your family before your father married her." The room was very quiet. "Min-jae," Tae-hyun said. His voice came out even, which required effort he wouldn't have predicted. "He managed the estate after my father died. He identified her assets. He oversaw the settlement. He knew she had this trust. He let her walk." Tae-hyun looked at the ceiling. "He let her walk, and he kept the trust active, and he's been using it as his primary vehicle for 4 years, which means—" He stopped because the full shape of it was assembling in his mind and he needed a moment to let it complete without interruption. Lee Seong-a, the trust, the Cayman entity, the Singapore company, Hanguk Jin's investment vehicle as the public-facing parent, the visible layer, the one that pointed at the Han family if anyone looked. Behind it, Min Jae's vehicle, clean and invisible, having spent 4 years accumulating position while Tae Hyun ran the syndicate and trusted his uncle and didn't look at the thing standing behind the thing. The Han family, he said. They're not the architects. They're the instrument, Imani said. They get the syndicate's shipping routes and casino operations and financial networks through the marriage agreement clauses. And Min Jae gets everything else, the legitimate holdings, the offshore accounts, and clean distance from the murder because it's the Han family's replacement security team on that yacht. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He was slightly amazed by that. He's been building this for 4 years, possibly longer. A pause. Possibly since before my father died. The last sentence landed in the room and stayed there. He didn't say what it implied. Imani didn't say it either. But it was there between them, the darkest version of the story, the one where this had been longer in motion than either of them had mapped. Imani closed the laptop. She sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed carefully, the way you breathed when something hurt and you were deciding not to acknowledge it. The federal dossier, she said. Everything I've built points at Min Jae as a co-conspirator with the Han family. It doesn't reflect the structure. It doesn't show the trust. It doesn't show that Min Jae may be the primary architect using the Han family as cover. She met his eyes. If we give the task force what I've currently documented, they arrest Gukjin and Seorin and the Han family's operational people. Min Jae has enough distance in the visible structure to walk. How long to rebuild the dossier around the correct structure? Starting from the trust documentation, a full day, maybe more. She pressed her hand against her side again. We have 2 days. 1 day. I need to give the task force lead time to prepare the warrants. She nodded. She was already calculating. He could see it, the triage happening behind her eyes, the mental architecture of the existing documentation being disassembled and restructured around the new central axis. She had built this thing once under conditions that had nearly killed her. She was preparing to rebuild it in 36 hours from a safe house bed while managing a knife wound, and she was looking at that task the way she looked at everything, as a problem with a solution that required sufficient precision and sufficient time. His phone buzzed. Ji-hoon. The number traced, Ji-hoon said. You were right. It's buried. 3 prepaid relays. But the originating cell tower puts the message origin in Apgujeong, sent at 11:47 p.m. He paused. You left the dinner at 11:15. Apgujeong, the restaurant. Someone at that table, or close to it, had sent the instruction to move on Imani within 32 minutes of Tae Hyun leaving the dinner. Min Jae left the restaurant before I did, Tae Hyun said. By about 20 minutes, according to the restaurant's exit log. I have a contact there. Another pause. Sir, there's something else. Chan Woo. I got to him before he could make any further contact, but in his personal effects, he had a photograph. Ji-hoon's voice was careful and flat, the voice of someone delivering something they know will land badly. Not the same photograph as the one sent to the safe house. A different one. This one was taken inside the syndicate offices. Tae-hun waited. It's Imani Brooks, Ji-hoon said. Taken approximately 3 weeks ago, based on what she's wearing. She's at her workstation, and she's looking at something on her screen. You can see the file directory structure in the background of the shot. A pause. Someone photographed her accessing the files she wasn't supposed to be accessing, and that photograph was in Chan Woo's possession, which means someone was watching her from inside the office for at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The entire time she'd been building the dossier, she'd been watched. Every day she'd sat at that workstation, cross-referencing and annotating and reconstructing deleted files. There had been a camera or a person recording it. And they'd waited. They'd let her build it, let her compile everything, let her gather the complete evidence of the conspiracy, and then they'd move to take it from her. They hadn't been trying to stop her from finding the truth. They'd been waiting for her to find all of it, so they could take it and eliminate the only person who could interpret it. He looked at Imani across the table. She was watching his face again with that careful, load-bearing attention, and he could see in her expression that she'd already heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand the shape of it. "They know about the dossier," she said. It was not a question. "They've known for 3 weeks." She absorbed that. Something moved through her face. Not the collapse he might have expected. Not the despair of someone who has spent weeks on work that has been compromised from the beginning. It was something harder and quieter than that. The expression of someone who has spent their whole life being underestimated and is, for a specific and terrible moment, unsurprised. "They let me build it," she said. "Yes." Because they wanted everything in one place. Every thread, every source document, every annotation, compiled and organized and cross-referenced. Her jaw tightened. So when they took the drive, they'd have a complete map of everything I knew, and they'd know exactly which loose ends to clean up. "The backup partitions," he said. "Do they know about those?" "I set them up this afternoon after the photograph was delivered." She looked at the flash drive on the table. If Chanwoo's surveillance was ongoing, they may have seen me access the cloud architecture. But the credentials for the backup partitions are isolated. They're not stored in any system connected to the syndicate network. They're in my head. That was something. Not enough, but something. "The original plan," he said. 3 days, let them believe the wedding is proceeding. Give the task force the dossier on the morning of the ceremony. He looked at the table. That plan was built on the assumption that we had the intelligence advantage. That we knew what they were planning, and they didn't know we knew. And now we know they've had surveillance on me for 3 weeks, which means they've been managing that assumption. She folded her hands. The question is what they actually know. They know I found the financial evidence. They know I made copies. They know you removed me from the apartment and that I survived. They sent Chanwoo's message, "Move on her tonight," which means they believe I still have actionable evidence. She paused. But they may not know about the trust, the Lee Seong-ah layer, because that's not something I documented before tonight. It's something I didn't know before tonight, which means it's the one piece they haven't been watching me compile. She looked at the laptop. If we rebuild the dossier around the correct architecture, Min Jae as primary, the Han family as instrument, we give the task force a structure they can't walk away from. Even with Min Jae's distance built into the visible layers, the trust documentation collapses it. His signature on the letter of wishes is a direct link that no amount of nominee structuring survives. Can you do it in a day? She looked at him with the quiet directness of a woman who had been doing impossible things on inadequate timelines for 6 years and had never once announced it. I'll need the full trust documentation from the Cayman Registration Authority. I can access it through the syndicate's offshore legal network, but the request will create a record. I'll route it through a third party. Someone Min Jae doesn't know I use. He stood. Get what rest you can tonight. I'll have the Cayman documentation to you by 6 a.m. He was at the door when she said his name, not his title, his name. Taehyun. He turned. She looked at him from the edge of the bed, small and exhausted and absolutely undeterred, and she said, "The thing Chanwoo's message tells us, the thing you haven't said out loud yet." He waited. "They're not afraid of the evidence anymore. They're afraid of me." She held his gaze. "Which means they've already decided the wedding plan is secondary. Whatever they're going to do it before the ceremony, and they're going to do it in the next 48 hours. A pause, very quiet. Not the yacht. Something else, something they haven't told us about yet. He stood in the doorway of the Yeongdongpo apartment and looked at her and understood that she was right, and that he had been circling the same conclusion for the last 20 minutes without letting himself land on it. The yacht was a plan built for a man who didn't know he was being killed. He knew. Which meant the yacht was useless to them now, which meant they had a contingency, which meant somewhere in the next 48 hours, at a time and in a manner he had not yet identified, someone was going to make a move that the wedding, the yacht, the entire 18-month architecture had been designed to avoid, a move that was direct and fast and left no room for... He didn't sleep. There was no version of the next 48 hours in which sleep was a reasonable allocation of time, so he didn't attempt it. He sat at the small table in the Yeongdongpo apartment after Imani finally closed the laptop at 2 a.m. Not because she'd finished, but because Sungmo had physically removed the computer from her hands and told her that working herself into a reopened wound was not a strategic decision. And he mapped the problem the way his father had taught him to map problems, from the outside in, identifying the perimeter before the center. The perimeter was this: Somewhere in the next 48 hours, Min Jae had a contingency move. Something direct. Something designed for a target who already knew he was being hunted. The center was this. Whatever that move was, it would come through a channel Tae-hyun trusted. Because that was how Min Jae worked. That was how he had always worked. Not through force, which was blunt and left evidence, but through architecture. Through the careful placement of people and information in positions where they would do exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment, and the hand that moved them would be invisible. Chan-woo had been one piece of that architecture, a positioned surveillance asset who'd spent 14 months being a reliable member of the security rotation while feeding location data and photographs to a burner relay. There were others. There had to be others. The question was not whether they existed, but how many and where, and whether Ji-hoon could find them before they activated. At 3 in the morning, he called Ji-hoon. "The security rotation for the next 48 hours, he said. "I want every assignment reviewed. Anyone placed in the last 18 months, cross-reference against the syndicate's HR records for Min Jae's involvement in the placement decision." "That's 14 people," Ji-hoon said. He sounded awake, which meant he hadn't slept either. "Do all 14. I'll need 6 hours. You have 4. A pause. "Understood." "And Ji-hoon, the wedding venue, the cathedral security setup. How many of those positions are filled by syndicate personnel versus contracted external?" "Split roughly 60-40, syndicate on the interior, contracted on the perimeter." "Who contracted the external team?" A silence that was 3 seconds too long. "Min Jae's office coordinated it," Ji-hoon said. 4 weeks ago. I reviewed the contractor credentials at the time. They cleared standard vetting. Run them again. All of them. Tonight. He ended the call and looked at the window. The curtains were heavy and closed, and the city outside was doing what the city always did at 3 in the morning. Breathing slowly, running on its overnight skeleton, indifferent. He thought about Min Jae's face at the dinner table, the way he'd looked at Tae-hyun when he'd asked about the yacht arrangements and gotten the answer he needed. The micro-relaxation, the small exhale. A man checking whether the mechanism was still on schedule. A man who'd been building this for 4 years. Maybe longer. Maybe since before his father died. He did not let himself stay on that thought for long. It was a thought for after, for whatever after looked like. Right now it was weight he couldn't carry and still move at the speed he needed to move. At 4:30 in the morning, his phone rang. Not Ji-hoon. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, low, careful, accented in a way that placed her somewhere between Seoul and somewhere else, the accent of someone who had spent a long time away. "You don't know me," she said, "but I think you found my name in the last few hours." He went very still. "Lee Seong-ah," he said. A pause. "I've been watching the trust activity. When someone accessed the Cayman registry documents tonight, I received an alert." Her voice was steady but not calm, the steadiness of someone holding something together through effort. "I've been waiting for someone to find that document for 4 years." He stood up slowly. His heart was doing something loud and deliberate in his chest. "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe. For now." A short breath. "I'm not your enemy. I need you to understand that before I say anything else. What I did, staying after your father died, staying long enough for Min Jae to believe I was manageable, it was the only way I could document what he'd done. What he'd done to my father." A silence that confirmed everything the silence contained. "He didn't arrange your father's death directly," she said. "He arranged the conditions, the medication protocol that your father's private physician recommended, the physician Min Jae had been paying for 6 years. Cardiac events in men your father's age are not investigated unless someone asks for investigation." Her voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this for a long time and is determined to say it correctly. "I was 26 when I married your father. I was not the woman Min Jae told you I was. Your father he was a complicated man, but he was not cruel to me. And I watched him die, and I understood what I was watching, and I was 26 years old in a house full of people who worked for the man who had done it." Tae-hyun stood in the dark of the Yongdong-po apartment and breathed. "Why didn't you come to me?" Because you were 24 and you were grieving and you were surrounded by Min Jae's people on every side, and I had no proof, only what I'd seen and what I suspected. If I'd come to you with nothing but suspicion, Min Jae would have discredited me inside an hour. Another short breath. So I took what I could access, the trust documentation, the early financial records, things he didn't know I'd seen, and I left. And I've been building a parallel record for 4 years. You have documentation. I have everything that predates the syndicate records your assistant has been compiling. The original account structures, the physician's payment records, the correspondence between Min Jae and Han Guk Jin going back 5 years before your father's death. A pause. Together with what your assistant has built, it's not a conspiracy case. It's a complete criminal history. Taehyun looked at the bedroom door, behind which Imani was sleeping or attempting to sleep. He thought about what she'd said earlier, the thing they hadn't said out loud yet, the contingency move, something direct. He knows I've accessed the trust documents, he said. The registry alert goes to both of us, which means he knows the trust is exposed. Taehyun was already moving toward the bedroom. He knows the Lee Seong-ah layer is compromised, which means his distance from the visible structure is gone. He pushed the door open. Imani was awake, had been awake probably for the last hour. She was sitting up in the dark with the flash drive in her hand, looking at him with eyes that had already calculated that the phone call was significant. "Where are you?" he said into the phone. "Mapo," Lee Seong-ah said. "I've been in Seoul for 2 weeks. I came back when I saw the registry activity that told me someone inside the syndicate was following the trust chain." A pause. "I have hard copy documentation, original files, 12 years of records. I'm sending someone to you in the next 30 minutes. Do not open the door for anyone else." He gave her Sungmo's number and ended the call. He looked at Imani. "We have a second source," he said. "Everything changes." She looked at him for a moment, reading his face the way she read everything. How much changes? The scope, the depth, and the timeline. He sat on the edge of the bed. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that she could hear. He knew she could hear it because she heard everything. "Min Jae may have been responsible for my father's death." The room was very quiet. Imani looked at him steadily. She didn't say she was sorry, which he was grateful for, because he couldn't have received that right now. What she said was, "Does that change what we're doing?" "No." "Does it change how you're doing it?" He thought about that for a moment with the honesty the question deserved. It makes it harder to keep the federal task force as the primary instrument. What she's describing, if she has the documentation she says she has, it's not just the conspiracy against me. It's a 12-year criminal history including a possible homicide. That's a different scale of case. "It's a stronger case," Imani said, "for the task force. It's a case that Min Jae will fight with everything he has because there's no version of it where he walks." He stood, which means when he understands that the trust is compromised, and he understands it now because the registry alert was automatic, he has nothing left to protect. He has no contingency that ends with him free, which makes him extremely dangerous, she said quietly. A man with nothing to lose and 30 years of organizational knowledge and… She stopped. Her eyes moved to the window. Ji-hoon's review of the security rotation. How long until he finishes? 2 more hours. 2 hours is too long. She swung her legs off the bed. He started to say something, and she stopped him with a look that was not hostile, but was absolute. I know what Shin said. I'm not interested in what Shin said right now." She stood up, carefully, one hand against the wall, the gray sweatshirt, the careful management of the wound. If Min Jae knows the trust is exposed, his contingency move isn't 48 hours away. It's now, tonight, because waiting means the evidence multiplies, and every hour that passes is an hour where more people know what he's done. She looked at Tae-hyun directly. "Where are you most exposed right now? At this moment? Tonight?" He ran through it. The Yongdongpo apartment was clean. Sungmo was on his way to pick up Lee Seong-ah, which meant the apartment's external security was reduced to the 2 men Ji-hoon had positioned on the building's ground floor. The syndicate's main offices were staffed overnight by a skeleton crew, The penthouse was... He stopped. My penthouse, he said. She nodded. It's where you're supposed to be. It's where Min Jae's people would expect you to be tonight, 2 days before your wedding. If they've had location surveillance on you, they know your patterns. They know you almost always go back there. She paused. If I were planning a contingency that needed to look like something other than assassination... His phone rang. Ji-hoon. He answered immediately. I've only gotten through 6 of the 14, Ji-hoon said, and his voice was tight in a way that Ji-hoon's voice almost never was. But I need you to hear this now. 3 of the 6 have placement decisions that trace to Min Jae's office. All 3 are assigned to the penthouse overnight security rotation tonight. The penthouse. 3 compromised positions out of however many total in the overnight rotation. An apartment where Min Jae had known Taehyun would be, where Taehyun was supposed to be, where Taehyun was not. Pull all 3 off rotation right now, Taehyun said. Use a systems error, a scheduling conflict, anything. Do not tell them why. And Ji-hoon, do it in the next 10 minutes. Already moving. A pause. Sir, if this was the contingency... An accident in the penthouse, Taehyun said. A fire, a gas leak, something that reads as tragedy and not murder. 3 positioned men who could either confirm my presence or create the conditions themselves. He looked at Amani. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes moving rapidly, processing, restructuring. We just burned the contingency. Which means he's out of moves, Ji-hoon said. Which means he's going to do something we haven't planned for. He felt it settle into him. Not fear, but the particular cold clarity of someone who has been playing a game of position and has just watched the board simplify down to a direct line. No more architecture. No more distance. Finish the rotation review. Every remaining name. And Ji-hoon, where's Min Jae right now? His apartment in Gangnam. He has 2 of his personal security with him, both longtime staff, both clean, as far as I can determine. Keep eyes on him. Physical surveillance, not digital. I don't trust any digital channel right now. He ended the call. Sung-mo texted from across town. Package secured en route. Lee Seong-ah was in motion. Her 12 years of documentation was in motion. The trust layer was exposed. The penthouse contingency was burned. The wedding was 36 hours away, and the entire infrastructure of the conspiracy was collapsing from the outside in. And somewhere in his Gangnam apartment, Kang Min Jae was doing the same calculation Tae-hyun was doing and reaching the same conclusion from the other direction. We need to move faster, Amani said. I know. The dossier. What I have right now, it's not complete, but it's enough to initiate. If we give the task force what exists tonight, they can begin warrant preparation. By the time Lee Seong-ah's documentation is added, it strengthens the case, but the core is already there. Yes. She pushed off the wall and moved to the table, and he could see what it cost her, the specific tightening around her eyes that she refused to let become anything more visible than that. She opened the laptop. I need 2 hours to prepare the submission package. Clean, formatted, with a cover document that the task force lead can read without needing a financial analyst to interpret it. You have 2 hours. He was already pulling up his contact for the federal task force, not the official channel, which was monitored by 3 different interested parties, including, he now understood, at least one who worked for Min Jae, a personal contact. A woman named Inspector Yoo Ha-eun, who had been building a case against the Han family for 4 years and who had given Tae-hyun her private number at a charity function 2 years ago with the specific, meaningful look of someone leaving a door open for a particular future moment. That moment was now. He went into the hallway to make the call. Sung-mo was still en route. The 2 men Ji-hoon had positioned on the ground floor were visible on his phone's security feed, standing, alert, in position. The building was quiet. Inspector Yu answered on the 4th ring. She sounded awake, which suggested she either didn't sleep much or had been expecting this. It's Kang, he said. A short silence. I wondered when this call was coming. I have documentation for you, comprehensive. Financial transaction chains, corporate structure analysis, personnel files, and communication records covering 18 months of conspiracy and 12 years of criminal history. He paused. The target is not primarily the Han family. Han Gyuk-jin is an instrument. The architect is closer to me than that. Another silence, longer. How soon can I have it? 2 hours for the primary package. Secondary documentation arriving from a separate source within 24 hours that will close the homicide angle. A pause that told him she'd heard the word homicide and understood its weight. This is going to require me to move some things around. I understand that. And it's going to require me to trust that what you're giving me is clean. The woman who compiled it spent 3 weeks doing it right, he said. It's clean. He ended the call and went back inside. Imani was working. She had the laptop and the notepad and the flash drive, and she was moving through the dossier with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they have and exactly what shape it needs to take. Her right hand moved between keyboard and notepad without hesitation. Her left hand was pressed flat against her side, not the checking gesture from before, but the sustained pressure of active pain management, and she was doing it so automatically that he didn't think she was aware of it anymore. He sat across from her and said nothing for a while, letting her work. After 40 minutes, she looked up. I need the Lee Seong-ah documentation, the physician payment records specifically. The task force will need the homicide angle cross-referenced with the financial structure to understand why it matters. Sungmo is 40 minutes out. She nodded and went back to work. At 6:15 in the morning, Sungmo came through the door with a woman who was 42 years old and looked like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had not yet decided whether to put it down. Lee Seong-ah was slight and composed in the way that people were composed when the alternative was falling apart, and she looked at Tae-hyun for a long moment in the doorway of the Yeongdongpo apartment with an expression that contained approximately 10 years of complicated things she had no space to say. She set a document case on the table without preamble. 12 years, original files, organized with the precision of someone who had understood that these documents were the only protection she had. Imani looked at the case, looked at Lee Seong-ah, and said, "Sit down. I need you to walk me through the physician records first." Lee Seong-ah sat down. They worked. Tae-hyun stood at the window for a while, and then he called Ji-hoon. "Rotation review is complete," Ji-hoon said. 5 compromised placements in total. All 5 have been rotated off their assignments. 4 are in holding. My people have them physically contained. The 5th called in sick at 5 a.m. A pause. His phone is off. The 5th man. Off the grid. Uncontained. Name? Ryu Dae-jung. He's been with the syndicate 3 years. Placed initially by Ji-hoon paused for one beat. By Min Jae's office. He had rotating assignments across the penthouse security and the Cheongdam office building. Another pause. He also had a vehicle access credential for the syndicate's underground garage. The garage. Access to vehicles, access to the building's internal systems, access to the physical infrastructure of the syndicate's main operational building where, in 34 hours, the pre-wedding final coordination meeting was scheduled, a meeting that every senior member of the organization would attend, that Min Jae had insisted on convening as a unity gesture 3 days ago, that Tae-hyun had agreed to because canceling it would have signaled something. He understood then what the contingency was. Not the penthouse, not a fire, not an accident in the night. The meeting. The pre-wedding coordination meeting in the Cheongdam building. A room full of senior leadership, a credentialed man with building access who had been off the grid since 5 a.m., and Min Jae at the head of the table in the last position he would ever occupy as the man in charge. Not an assassination of one person. A decapitation of the entire syndicate leadership in a single event, in a room that Min Jae would excuse himself from at the last moment for a reason that would seem entirely ordinary, leaving behind a building full of people he needed dead and a positioned asset with the access to make it happen. Tae-hyun looked at the window. The city was fully awake outside, indifferent and immense. "Ji-hoon," he said, "the Cheongdam building. I need it swept right now, every floor, every access point, every storage space in the garage level and the service corridors. And I need Ryu Dae-jung found before—" His phone lit up with a second call. Unknown number. He looked at the screen for 1 second, then he answered. "I think," said Kang Min-jae's voice, quiet and steady and carrying 30 years of familiarity that now landed like something unclean, "that it's time for us to talk. Just the 2 of us. The way your father and I used to talk when things became complicated." A pause. "Come to the Cheongdam building. Come now, come alone. If you do, I'll tell you where Ryu Dae-jung is and what he's carrying." Another pause, the kind that was designed to be felt. If you don't, the meeting tomorrow proceeds as scheduled. With or without you, and he went. Not because Min-jae had leverage, not because he believed the implied threat about Ryu Dae-jung would be honored if he complied, or that coming alone would produce the clean conversation his uncle was pretending to offer. He went because there was a man somewhere in the Cheongdam building with credentials and access and an unknown payload, and because the alternative, waiting while Ji-hoon's people swept floor by floor in a building they didn't know as well as Ryu Dae-jung did, was a calculation that didn't close cleanly enough. He told Amani before he left. He owed her that. She looked at him from the table where she and Lee Seong-ah were still working, and the look on her face was not the one he'd expected. Not fear, not the attempt to dissuade him. She set down her pen and looked at him with the careful, load-bearing attention she'd given him since the beginning, and she said, "The dossier will be ready in 40 minutes. I'll send it to Inspector Yu the moment it's complete, whether you're there or not." "I know. So you understand that if this goes wrong, it doesn't stop. That's why I'm telling you." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up her pen. "Come back," she said, and went back to work. He drove to Cheongdam alone. The building was one of the syndicate's legitimate properties, a 12-story commercial building housing Baeko Capital's official offices on floors 7 through 10, with financial services tenants on the lower floors and a 2-level underground garage that connected to the service corridor network running beneath the block. At 6:40 in the morning, the lobby was staffed by a single overnight security guard who looked at Tae-hyun without surprise, which meant he'd been told to expect him, which meant Min-jae had been confident he'd come. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. 12 floors. He used the time to breathe and to think and to let the anger that had been building since 4:30 in the morning settle into something useful. Not cold, because cold wasn't what this needed. Something more precise than cold. The anger of a man who has identified every thread of a thing and is prepared to pull them all at once. Ji-hoon's voice came through his earpiece on the 8th floor landing. "We have Ryu, ground-level service corridor, east access." He had a bag. A pause, tight and controlled. "Incendiary device, commercial grade, set for a timer trigger, configured for the main conference room on floor 9. Another pause. "He's contained. Device is contained. My people are handling it." Tae-hyun stopped on the landing and let that move through him. The conference room on floor 9. The pre-wedding coordination meeting. Every senior member of the syndicate in one room and a fire configured for maximum damage, and Min-jae stepping out for a phone call at the right moment. He had been right about the shape of it. He was not particularly glad to have been right. "Min-jae," he said quietly, "still showing on surveillance in the 9th floor conference room. He's been there for 20 minutes. He's alone." Tae-hyun climbed the last 4 floors. The 9th floor was quiet, in the particular way of offices before business hours. The hum of systems running without people. The flat light of overnight fluorescence on carpet and glass. He walked the length of the corridor toward the main conference room and felt the building around him the way he'd felt it for 6 years. The familiar weight of a place where he had made decisions and held meetings and run the operational machinery of an empire he'd inherited at 24 from a father who had not died naturally. He pushed open the conference room door. Kang Min-jae was sitting at the head of the long table. Not standing, not positioned for anything aggressive. Sitting, in the chair he always occupied, with a cup of coffee in front of him that was probably cold by now, and his hands folded on the table in the attitude of a man who has been waiting patiently and intends that patience to communicate something. He looked older than he had at the dinner 18 hours ago. Or perhaps Tae-hyun was simply looking at him differently, seeing the subtraction of the performance layer, and what was underneath it was a 61-year-old man who had been carrying a very complicated secret for a very long time and was now, at the end of it, simply tired. Tae-hyun sat down across from him, not at the far end. Across from him, close, the way you sat when you wanted someone to have to look at you. "You found Ryu," Min-jae said. It was not a question. "Yes." Min-jae nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee cup. "I want you to know," he said, "that I spent a great deal of time trying to find a version of this that didn't end here." "Did you?" "Yes." He said it simply, without defense. "You were not supposed to find her, the Brooks woman. I had people watching her building. I knew she hadn't left. But the timeline for moving on her was, I miscalculated the response window. I thought I had until morning. He looked up. When you went yourself alone at 5 in the morning, I hadn't modeled for that. You don't do things like that. Apparently I do. Min-jae looked at him with something that was almost the warmth it resembled. Your father would have sent people. He never went himself. It was one of his few genuine weaknesses as a leader. A pause. You're better than he was, in certain ways. I've always believed that. Don't, Taehyun said. Min-jae stopped. Whatever you're about to do with that, Taehyun said. Don't. Tell me about my father. A long silence. The fluorescent hum. The cold coffee. 61 years of a man's face arranging itself around the shape of a thing it had been arranged around for a long time. He was going to dismantle it, Min-jae said finally. Everything we'd built, 30 years. He'd been in conversation with a federal mediator for 8 months. I found out because I built the communication systems. I know every channel. He was preparing to negotiate a structural dissolution, legitimate transition, he called it. Hand the criminal operations to federal oversight in exchange for immunity and a clean exit. He paused. He was 63 years old, and he was tired, and he had decided that his legacy mattered more to him than the organization. And you decided it didn't. I decided that 30 years of work and every person whose livelihood depended on that organization didn't deserve to be traded for one man's peace of mind. He said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with heat. I believed that then. I'm not certain I believe everything I believed then. His physician. Min-jae didn't flinch. He'd known this was coming. Yes, he was 63 years old and he was tired, and you had his doctor adjust his medication until his heart stopped. Yes. The word sat in the room. One syllable, 4 years of a grave and a funeral and a grief that Taehyun had carried without knowing what was underneath it. He breathed through it, the full weight of it, and he did not look away from his uncle's face. And then you handed me the empire, Taehyun said. You sat across from me at that table for 4 years, and you handed me things, and taught me things, and watched me build it further, and the entire time, I believed you were the right person to run it. Min-jae met his eyes. That part was never a performance. You were the right person. You are the right person. What I built with the Han family, what I arranged with Gyuk-jin, it wasn't about your capability. It was about control. He paused. I'm 61 years old. I've run this organization from the shadows for 30 years, and I've watched other men get the credit and the authority and the seat at the head of the table. The Han Alliance was the first time I built something entirely for myself. He looked at the table. I'm not asking you to understand it. Good, because I don't. Another silence. Lee Seong-ah, Taehyun said. Min-jae closed his eyes briefly. She was smarter than I calculated. You let her leave. I couldn't move against her without raising questions I didn't want raised about your father's death. She had no proof. She had suspicion and grief, and whatever she'd managed to copy from the estate records. He paused. I underestimated what she'd do with 4 years and a clean exit. She built a parallel record, 12 years, original documentation. He watched Min-jae's face process that. The physician's payment records, the correspondence with Gyuk-jin going back 5 years before my father died. Everything. Min-jae was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not the collapse Taehyun might have expected, but a kind of settlement, the expression of a man reaching the bottom of a thing and finding that the bottom, at least, is solid. Then it's done, Min-jae said. Yes, the federal task force. The dossier was submitted 40 minutes ago. They're preparing warrants. He paused. For you, for Han Guk-jin, for Seo-rin, and for every member of the replacement security team. The homicide angle will require a separate investigation, but the financial documentation is sufficient to hold everyone on the conspiracy charges while that investigation proceeds. Min-jae nodded. He looked at his hands, large, still, the hands of a man who had built things and also destroyed them with the same deliberate precision. The wedding, he said. Will proceed as scheduled, Taehyun said. Every conspirator will be present. The task force will have arrest warrants ready before the ceremony begins. Min-jae looked up. Something in his eyes shifted. The calculation of a man who had spent 30 years thinking 3 moves ahead and was mapping this one. You're going to let it play out in public. I'm going to let everyone in that room, the politicians, the executives, the foreign families, the media, I'm going to let every one of them watch it end. He held his uncle's gaze. 30 years of shadows. This ends in the light. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. The warmth that wasn't warmth anymore. The familiar face of a man who had sat across from him at tables his entire life and who he would never sit across from freely again. Your father, Min-jae said quietly, would have done this differently. I know, Taehyun said. That's the point. He stood up and walked to the door and opened it, and Ji-hoon was there in the corridor with 2 of his people and a federal liaison who had arrived in the building 10 minutes earlier with paperwork that was already in order. Taehyun did not look back. The wedding proceeded. It was the most expensive event of the year in a city that staged expensive events the way other cities staged arguments, constantly and with tremendous investment of ego. The cathedral in Jongno had been prepared for 3 months. Flowers that had been flown in, a guest list that read like a directory of everything powerful and compromised in South Korea, camera crews from 3 media outlets who had been told this was the social event of the season and had no reason to believe otherwise. Taehyun arrived at the appointed time. He was dressed correctly. He stood at the front of the cathedral and watched the doors and waited. Han Seorin came down the aisle in white, which was either irony or audacity, and he'd stopped trying to determine which. She was beautiful and composed, and she looked at him with an expression that was warm and calibrated, and that he now read the way he read everything about her. As a performance executed with genuine skill by a person who had confused the performance with herself so thoroughly that the distinction no longer existed. He watched her walk toward him. He thought about 6 years, about a woman who sat in the back corner of his conference rooms and said almost nothing and retained everything. About a bathroom floor at 5 in the morning and a fist that wouldn't release a flash drive. About 3 weeks of building something under surveillance in silence, without recognition, because it was the right thing to do, and she had decided to do it, and that was sufficient. He thought about what it cost to be invisible in a room full of people who needed you and didn't see you, and to stay anyway, and to choose the harder thing anyway, and to bleed on a cold floor rather than make the phone call that would have been the easier betrayal. The officiant spoke the words that the ceremony required. When the question came, the particular formal question that the occasion demanded, Taehyun reached into his jacket pocket. Not for vows, for a flash drive that was a copy of the copy of the copy, because Amani Brooks did not build redundancies half-heartedly. He walked to the presentation system at the side of the altar. The screens were large. The cathedral was full. The silence that fell when he inserted the drive and the first document appeared on the screens was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes simultaneously that the occasion they came for is not the occasion they're attending. The financial records came first, clean, annotated, structured exactly the way Amani had structured them. Not to overwhelm, but to make the story unmistakable. The transaction chains, the shell companies, the routing sequences with their coded destination tags, the $43 million moving through 8 entities across 4 jurisdictions into the trust vehicle that carried Lee Seong-ah's name over Min-jae's signature. Then the emails. The restored, annotated communications between Min-jae and Han Gyuk-jin, with Imani's plain language translations alongside the coded originals. The wedding, the yacht, the replacement security team, the marriage agreement clauses. The real ones, not the version Taehyun had been shown. Spelling out in the dry language of offshore legal documentation exactly what was supposed to happen to him in the 6 months following the ceremony. Then the physician records, the payment documentation, the 12-year history that Lee Seong-ah had built in exile and carried back to Seoul 2 weeks ago because she had decided, like Amani, that there was a harder thing available and that it was the right one. The room did not erupt immediately. It went through stages, confusion, then comprehension, then the kind of collective human noise that happens when a large group of people are forced to revise their understanding of where they are and what they're part of. Politicians who had smiled for photographs with Han Gyuk-jin, corporate executives who had built structures on top of Baeko Syndicate OPA infrastructure without asking too many questions, foreign family representatives who had come to witness an alliance and were watching something else entirely unspool on screens above an altar. Han Guk-jin stood up. He was 67 years old, and he had the bearing of a man who had survived a great deal, and what crossed his face in the moment he understood what he was looking at was not fear, but the specific expression of someone recalculating rapidly and finding that every path forward ends at the same place. Seo-rin turned to Tae-hyun. Her composure held longer than he expected. It held until the yacht security documentation appeared on the screen, until the personnel files for the replacement crew were displayed with their traced connections to Haesong Protection Services and its Han family ownership chain, and then something behind her eyes went through a change that was like watching a building's internal structure fail. Invisible on the outside for one more second, and then not. "You knew," she said. Her voice was low, not the calibrated warmth. Something stripped and real underneath it. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." She looked at the screens, she looked at the room, she looked at him with an expression that was stripped of every layer of performance, simply exhausted. "I didn't want—" She stopped. "I know," he said, because he did know. He had looked at enough of the documentation to understand that Seo-rin had been positioned in this plan the way everyone in the Han family was positioned. Not as an architect, but as a piece, a useful instrument moved by her father's hand, and that she had understood this and accepted it, and told herself that acceptance was the same as agency. It wasn't. But it wasn't nothing either, and he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. The main doors opened. Inspector Yoo Ha-eun entered with 12 federal officers and a set of arrest warrants that had been prepared through the night and were now ready for execution. She moved through the cathedral with the focused efficiency of someone who had been building toward this room for 4 years and intended to conduct herself in it with complete precision. Kang Min-jae was not present. He had been in federal custody since 6:52 that morning, arrested in the Cheongdam building conference room by the liaison Ji-hoon had let through the door, with paperwork that was already in order and a case that did not require Tae-hyun's testimony to initiate. Han Guk-jin was arrested at the altar. He went quietly, with the dignity of a man who has always understood that being taken quietly is itself a form of power. 2 of his operational lieutenants, seated in the 3rd row, were arrested simultaneously. Seo-rin was arrested last. She looked at Tae-hyun once more before Inspector Yu's people reached her. Whatever she was going to say, she didn't say it. She straightened her dress, a gesture so automatic it broke the surface of everything else for a moment, the deeply ordinary human reflex of composing yourself when composure is the only thing left. And she walked out of the cathedral between 2 federal officers with her head level. The room had become something else entirely. Cameras that had come to document a wedding were documenting an arrest. Guests who had come for champagne and social positioning were calling their lawyers. The flowers, which had been flown in from 3 countries and arranged by people who had spent a week on their placement, remained exactly where they were, indifferent to the occasion having changed. Tae-hyun stood at the front of the cathedral and watched the room empty around him and felt the specific quality of the aftermath vibes. Not triumph, because triumph was for people who had won something clean, and nothing about this had been clean. Something more complicated. The sensation of a weight that has been removed from a structure, and the structure standing anyway, and the surprise of that. The doors at the back of the cathedral opened again. She was using the cane that Dr. Shin had brought to the Yeongdeungpo apartment 2 days ago, and that she had used the same way she managed everything. Not with self-consciousness, but with the practical acceptance of what a body needed after what a body had been through. She was dressed in dark clothing, not dressed for a wedding, dressed for a woman who had spent 36 hours rebuilding a legal case and had not particularly planned what came after. She walked the length of the cathedral aisle with the measured pace of someone managing a wound, and also managing the weight of an enormous room's attention shifting to her, and she did both without visible difficulty, which Tae-hyun had by now come to understand was simply her baseline. She was carrying a document case. She stopped in front of Inspector Yu, who had remained at the front of the cathedral to oversee the final processing. She set the case on the pew beside her and opened it and placed a second set of documentation, original files, Lee Seong-ah's 12-year archive, organized in the same meticulous structure she brought to everything, in front of the inspector. The supplementary record, Imani said. Cross-reference to the primary dossier. The homicide documentation begins on tab 4. She paused. You'll find everything sequenced for investigative use. Inspector Yu looked at the documentation, looked at Imani, and said, "This is thorough." It needed to be. Taehyun walked toward her. She looked up when he was close, and whatever she'd been holding together through the last 36 hours was still held together, but only just, and he could see the cost of it now in a way he hadn't been allowed to see before. The exhaustion under the composure. The specific aftermath of a person who has been running on necessity for a very long time and has arrived at the moment when necessity stops. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "It's over." She looked at the empty cathedral, the arrested, the departed, the flowers still standing for an occasion that had become something else. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" A pause that was honest rather than reflexive. "Not entirely, but I will be." He nodded. That was enough. That was exactly enough. In the weeks that followed, the Baeko syndicate did not collapse. This was not automatic. There was a week where it could have gone either way, where the federal investigation's ripple effects and the public nature of the arrests created a pressure that might have fractured the organization's legitimate holdings and produced the dissolution that Min Jae's version of events would eventually have produced anyway, only faster and messier. It did not fracture because Taehyun held it together with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this specific emergency without knowing he was preparing for it, and because the people who remained, the ones whose placements predated Min Jae's 18-month architecture, the ones Ji-hoon had cleared, understood what was being asked of them and responded to it. The criminal operations restructured. That was the honest word for it, not the euphemistic one. Federal investigators received ongoing cooperation in exchange for the same ongoing cooperation back, which was a particular kind of relationship that required clarity about what each side was and was not willing to do. Inspector Yu turned out to have a highly developed understanding of clarity, which made her useful in a sustained way. Min Jae's trial was long and documented and public in the specific punishing way of trials that are also national conversations. The physician's payment records, combined with the financial documentation and Lee Seong-ah's testimony, produced a case that the defense spent 14 months attempting to dismantle without success. He was convicted on the criminal conspiracy charges within the year. The homicide investigation ran parallel, slower, and arrived at its conclusions without fanfare in the second year. Han Guk-jin accepted a plea arrangement that preserved the remnants of his legitimate holdings and surrendered his criminal infrastructure. His daughter's case was tried separately and concluded with a lesser sentence than her father's, which reflected both the instrument versus architect distinction and the judgment of a court that took seriously the question of what agency looked like inside a family that had never offered its children a genuine choice. Lee Seong-ah testified. She did it without drama and with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for 4 years, and when it was done, she remained in Seoul, which surprised people who had assumed she would leave again. She did not explain her reasons and was not required to. The syndicate's senior counsel met 3 weeks after the arrests, in the same 9th floor conference room where Tae-hyun had sat across from Min Jae for the last time. It was a full council. Every remaining department head, every senior operational officer, all of them present in the flat morning light of a room that smelled like coffee and carpet, and the specific institutional quality of decisions being made with permanence. Tae-hyun stood at the head of the table and looked at the people in front of him. 6 years ago, he said, this organization hired an assistant. She processed financial records, managed encrypted files, attended briefings, and sat in the back of this room and said almost nothing. He paused. 8 weeks ago, she identified a conspiracy that would have destroyed this organization and killed me and several of you. She identified it alone, documented it under surveillance, survived 2 assassination attempts, and rebuilt the complete evidentiary record in 36 hours from a safe house with a knife wound that should have put her in a hospital. He looked around the table. She did this without a title, without authority, and without anyone in this room having the awareness to ask what she was carrying. He looked at Imani, who was seated to his right. She was looking at the table in the particular way of a person who is not comfortable being the subject of a room's attention and is managing it with the same practical competence she managed everything. That changes today, Taehyun said. Amani Brooks is appointed Chief Strategic Partner of the Bioco Syndicate with full operational authority equivalent to my own on all matters of financial structure, intelligence, and organizational security. He paused. Does anyone have a question about that appointment? Nobody said anything. Not because they were afraid to, though some of them were. Because every person in that room had spent the last 3 weeks reading the documentation that had been distributed as part of the internal review, and every person in that room now understood with complete clarity what had been in front of them for 6 years and what it had cost her to protect something that had not yet learned to protect her. Imani looked up from the table. She looked at the room, at the faces of the people who had walked past her desk for 6 years and registered her as furniture, and were now looking at her with the expression of a recalibration in progress. She did not perform graciousness. She did not perform anything. "Thank you," she said simply, to the room and to Taehyun, and the 2 words landed with the specific weight of a person who does not say things they don't mean and who means this one completely. Afterward, when the room had cleared and the city outside was moving through its afternoon with the indifference it brought to everything, Taehyun settled the last of the things that needed settling. Her mother's medical bills, the full cost of the nursing home care, paid, cleared, a standing arrangement that would not require renewal or renegotiation. The family debt. Gone. Not as a transaction, not as a calculation of what her work had been worth, but as the specific acknowledgement of a man who understands that some debts aren't financial and that the financial ones are the easiest part. She found out from Dr. Shin, who handled the administrative details because Taehyun had understood correctly that she would argue if told directly. She came to his office afterward and stood in the doorway with an expression that was difficult to read because it contained several things at once: gratitude and something more complicated than gratitude, and the specific discomfort of a person who has spent her life expecting nothing and has had that expectation overturned. He looked up from his desk. "You could have asked me first," she said. "You would have said it wasn't necessary." "It wasn't." She stopped, started again. "It shouldn't have been necessary in the first place." "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't have been." She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she came into the room and sat in the chair across from his desk. Not the chair in the corner, not the back of the room. The chair across from him, the one that was there for that purpose. Weeks later, several weeks later, when the trials were underway and the organizational restructuring had found its shape, and the particular pressure of an emergency sustained over months had finally, gradually, released. They were on the rooftop terrace of the penthouse. It was evening, the kind of sole evening in autumn that is cold enough to be honest and clear enough that the Han River was visible in the distance, a dark ribbon carrying the city's light in pieces. She had the cane still, though she used it less than she had. The wound had healed cleanly. There would be a scar, which she had mentioned once, and not again. He was looking at the river. She was looking at the city the way she always looked at things, taking the full inventory of it, not missing the parts that were harder to see. 6 years ago, he said. "Yes." "I read your personnel file 3 times. She turned to look at him. "After the Macau discrepancy," he said, "and after the logistics skimming report. I read it because—" He paused, looking for the honest version. "Because you troubled me. Not in a way I examined. I just noticed that you were different from how things are usually arranged. And I read the file and then I went back to running the organization, and I didn't ask the question that the file was trying to answer." "What question was that?" "Why someone like you was here. What it cost you to be here. What you were choosing every day you came back." He looked at the river. "I should have asked it 6 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. The wind off the Han moved through the terrace, and she pulled her jacket slightly tighter, the small automatic adjustment of a person who notices what they need and addresses it without ceremony. "I stayed because the work was real," she said finally. "And because my mother was 3 kilometers from that office, and I needed the salary, and I was good at it." She paused. "And because somewhere in the first 2 years I looked at what you were building, and I thought, this could be something. This could be worth protecting." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think I was wrong about that." "You weren't. Though you could have made it considerably easier. Yes, he said. I could have. She looked back at the city. Below them, Seoul moved through its evening, indifferent and immense, and full of the particular life of a place that has survived everything it's been through so far and intends to survive the rest. The river carried light. The buildings held their lit windows up against the dark. Somewhere in the city, a woman named Lee Seong-ah was having dinner alone or with someone, beginning the process of reconstructing a life on the other side of a very long effort. Somewhere the trials continued. The documentation accumulated. The slow machinery of consequence turned. He looked at the woman standing beside him on the rooftop of the empire she had saved. Not the empire's executive assistant, not the woman who sat in the back corner, not the person everyone had failed to see. The person who had seen everything, who had carried it without being asked and without being thanked, and without once asking whether it was worth carrying. The strongest person in any room, he said. She turned to look at him. Someone told me that once, he said, recently, that the strongest person in any empire is rarely the one carrying the gun. He paused. I think I understand what that means now. She looked at him for a long moment with the full weight of her attention, the same attention she brought to financial records and annotated emails and the careful reconstruction of things that other people had tried to destroy. Then she turned back to the city and the river and the evening that was deepening around them both. Good, she said, and that was enough. In the way that honest things are always enough, and more than enough, and the kind of thing that doesn't require anything added to it. The city moved below them. The river held its light, and for the first time in a very long time, nothing was hidden.